Today, a Texas judge set a new execution date for a man convicted of violently shaking his 2-year-old daughter to death. He's now scheduled to die October 16th. If carried out, it would be the nation's first execution for a shaken baby conviction.
A young girl is found dead in her crib. Her father says it was an accident. The prosecutor says it was murder. The court sentenced him to die. But what if the truth never made it into Courtroom? What if the monster was not who we thought it was? This is the story of Robert Roberson, a grieving father, a convicted child killer, and the case that tore open the soul of a Texas town. The child's name was Nikki Curtis. She was just 2 years old, a fragile, soft-spoken baby girl with wide hazel eyes and a slight frame, born premature, plagued with health issues, asthma, chronic infections, a child who never stopped needing. Her world was small, a dingy trailer in Palestine, Texas, a sleepy town where trains pass more often than opportunity. She shared a bedroom with her father, in a space barely big enough for a single bed and a plastic crib pushed up against peeling wood panel walls. Nikki was quiet, even for a toddler. She did not speak much. She clung to a purple blanket with torn corners, and she loved juice boxes. That was her thing, juice boxes. Neighbors remember her barely above a whisper. She was often sick, often tired, often unseen. But in the rare moments she giggled, it was like the whole house came alive. Like even the stained, nicotine-soaked walls softened. Like the world was fair. For just a moment, Robert Roberson was 38 years old, a single father, unemployed, shy, socially withdrawn. He walked with his head down. He avoided eye contact in public, and he barely spoke above a mumble. He had been sexually abused as a child, beaten by his stepfather, rejected by his own mother. He had dropped out of school, lived in shelters, battled depression for most of his life. To outsiders, he looked like a shadow, but to Nikki, he was home. He changed her diapers, warmed her bottles, read her bedtime books with a soft, almost scared voice. He had been trying to stay sober, trying to raise a daughter in a world that had never raised him. Then came the night of January 31st, 2002. It was cold, unusually cold for East Texas. The heater in the trailer clicked sporadically. Outside, the sky pressed down like lead. Nikki had been sick for days, running a fever, coughing constantly. She refused food. She vomited several times, and she had trouble breathing. Robert gave her cough syrup. He tucked her into bed. He slept nearby, listening for her breathing, always listening. In the morning, she would not wake up. She was limp. Her skin was bluish-gray. Robert screamed her name, shook her gently, then harder. He rushed her to the hospital, carried her body in his arms, barefoot in the winter wind. Tears froze to his cheeks. Doctors said it was too late. Nikki was pronounced dead at 9:20 a.m. Robert collapsed on the ER floor. But moments later, everything changed. A nurse noticed bruising on Nikki's forehead. A doctor saw retinal hemorrhaging. They called it shaken baby syndrome, and they called the police. By noon, Robert Roberson was handcuffed. By nightfall, he was in jail. Detectives questioned him for hours. He was quiet, timid, confused. He told them she had fallen off the bed, a 19-inch fall, a small thud, but the doctors did not believe it. They said it was too much damage, too much swelling, too much bleeding. They painted him as a killer hiding behind grief, a man who snapped, a man who lost control. But they never told the jury Nikki had pneumonia, or that her brain may have swelled from lack of oxygen. They never told them about her history of health problems, or the medication she was on, or the potentially fatal interaction between those drugs and the over-the-counter syrup Robert gave her. They never told them science was changing, that shaken baby syndrome was collapsing under scrutiny, that hundreds of doctors had begun to question its validity, that new research showed shortfalls could be fatal, that infection could mimic trauma. But in that courtroom, Robert was not a man. He was a headline. He was the monster father, the cold-hearted killer, the man who murdered his baby in a trailer park, The jury never saw the whole truth. They saw photos of Nikki's bruised face. They heard a medical examiner say it could only have been shaking. They saw a man who did not cry on the witness stand. And they assumed guilt. Robert was sentenced to death. He has sat on death row for over 20 years, in a concrete cell, with a bed, a toilet, a photo of Nikki on the wall. He still says he loved her, still says he is innocent. But love is not evidence, and silence does not make a man innocent. Today, the science has changed. Even the prosecution's own experts have walked back their certainty. One of the doctors who testified against him now says she was wrong. The state's theory is collapsing, but Robert is still waiting for a system that does not like to admit it was wrong, waiting in a cage while the world argues over his soul. Outside, Nikki's grave is quiet, a simple marker, with a teddy bear carved into stone, and the words "little angel" beneath it, a child who suffered, a father who failed to save her, a justice system that may have failed them both. And somewhere in the middle of all of it lies a question we are all afraid to ask. What if the monster we created never existed at all? He was grieving, confused, overwhelmed. But within hours, Robert wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a suspect, a potential child killer. Police questioned him for hours. In a small, windowless room at the Palestine Police Department, he answered everything softly, nervously, often breaking down. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't think he needed one. He said Nikki had been sick, running a fever the day before. She'd had trouble breathing during the night. He tried to comfort her, rocked her in his arms, gave her a bottle, stayed up with her. But he admitted he had fallen asleep. And when he woke up, she wasn't breathing. That was enough. They said he was lying, that he'd snapped, that he shook her violently, fatally out of frustration. They arrested him on the spot. The charge, capital murder of his own daughter. And then came the trial. But not a trial of evidence. A trial of character. They showed pictures of Nikki's bruises. Spoke of bleeding in her brain and eyes. They didn't mention her pneumonia, or her previous hospitalizations, or the medications that made her drowsy. They said her injuries could only be caused by violent shaking. Medical certainty, they claimed. But was it, or was it a theory, one now deeply questioned? Years later, experts would say the science used to convict Robert Roberson was flawed, that symptoms of shaken baby syndrome could also be caused by pneumonia, by oxygen deprivation, by sepsis, by undiagnosed head trauma, even by a short fall from a bed. But in 2003, no one cared. The jury didn't hear from specialists in pediatric neurology or forensic pathology. They heard emotion, tears, a distraught mother, a dead child, and a poor, awkward father who didn't cry the way they thought he should. They convicted him, sentenced him to death. Death for shaking his daughter to death, based on science now widely discredited. And then the case faded, buried like Nikki herself. But not for everyone. Lawyers with the Innocence Project picked up the case years later, and what they found was chilling. Key evidence had been ignored. Autopsy results suggested Nikki had pneumonia, that she may have had a seizure, that she had fallen from a height before. One doctor even noted that her brain swelling could have come from prolonged illness, not shaking. But that wasn't in the trial. What was in the trial? A doctor who had never treated Nikki, a detective who misunderstood medical notes, and a narrative built not on fact, but on fear. Monster shakes baby to death. That's what the public wanted to believe. But was it the truth? In 2016, a judge agreed to hear new evidence. And in 2018, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a rare decision. They stayed Robert Roberson's execution. He was just 9 days from lethal injection. 9 days. The court cited false testimony, flawed science, a lack of due process. But did they reverse his conviction? No. Robert Roberson still sits on death row today, 20 years after Nikki's death, in a small cell, with no sunlight, no contact visits, just a Bible, and memories of a daughter whose life ended too soon. But was she murdered? Or did the system rush to blame a man who fit their idea of a killer. Poor, quiet, socially awkward, uneducated, but not evil. To this day, his lawyers fight for a new trial, to present the evidence no jury ever saw, the medical data, the updated science, the real story. But the state pushes back, hard, because to admit they were wrong would unravel more than one conviction. It would mean others, too, could be innocent, victims of a moral panic over shaken baby syndrome, of faulty science once trusted like gospel. Robert says he still dreams of Nikki. He dreams of her singing, of her messy curls bouncing as she dances, of that morning, over and over, wishing he had checked sooner, held her longer, gotten help faster. But he insists on one thing. He never hurt her, not once. So what do you believe? Is he a killer? Or a grieving father, crushed by a tragic accident, and then by a system too stubborn to say we were wrong? Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth. And in the case of Robert Roberson, the truth is still waiting. A nurse looked down at the body of a baby girl. She was cold, still. Purple-red splotches lined her back like bruise petals. Her name was Nikki Curtis, and her death would shake a small Texas town to its knees. It was a warm summer evening in Palestine, Texas. Children played in backyards. Mothers chatted across porches. But behind one door, inside a single-story house on East Point Tap Road, a father was cradling a dying child. Robert Roberson claimed Nikki had fallen off the bed, said she was sleepy, said she just needed rest. But when she arrived at the hospital, unresponsive, with brain swelling, doctors sounded the alarm. Her injuries were not consistent with fall. They screamed of blunt force trauma, of violent shaking. The words came fast and hard, shaken baby syndrome. And Robert was arrested. But what if he was not lying? What if the system had already decided guilt before the facts were known? Robert Roberson was not what most would call a monster. He was quiet, withdrawn, mild-mannered. He had grown up poor, abused, taught early that emotions were dangerous. He clung to God, to routine, to silence. And when Nikki was born, he changed, became a man who washed bottles at 2 a.m., who rocked her for hours when colic kept her from sleeping, who called her angel girl with a cracked, reverent voice. But that night, something happened. And now, Nikki was gone. The prosecution painted Robert as violent, said he snapped, lost control, used his strength against a helpless child. They pointed to his criminal record, minor, nonviolent charges. They showed no evidence of prior abuse. But they did not need it. A pathologist testified that Nikki's brain was sloshed like jelly. Her eyes showed retinal hemorrhaging. Classic signs, they said, of shaken baby syndrome. But what they left out was that Nikki had pneumonia, that she had stopped breathing days before, that she had been seizing, that the fall from the bed was not entirely ruled out, that the science behind shaken baby had already begun to unravel. Robert's court-appointed lawyer did not challenge the science, did not bring in alternate medical experts, did not explain that Nikki had been ill, dangerously so, and untreated. And no one asked why a grieving father was being marched to death row. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty, the death penalty. In that moment, Robert did not scream. He did not cry. He looked down at his hands, like they belonged to someone else, and whispered the name Nikki, as if speaking it might change time, might unbreak her neck, might undo everything. But death, like the law, does not listen. Years passed. Robert waited in a cement cell, gray walls, metal cot, fluorescent light that never dimmed. He wrote letters to his mother, prayers to his daughter. He begged for someone to believe him. Then a crack. Forensic scientists began questioning shaken baby syndrome. Studies showed that low oxygen from illness could mimic the same symptoms: retinal hemorrhages, brain swelling, death, infections like pneumonia. A new defense team formed. Digging, uncovering, pneumonia, seizure, hypoxia. They filed an appeal, claimed Robert's trial had been medically flawed. that he had been convicted by junk science. And yet, Nikki was still dead, a baby, gone, alone in her tiny coffin beneath East Texas dirt. Could Robert's innocence bring her back? Or was he a killer hiding behind technicalities? That was the question. A question burning in every courtroom whisper, every parole review, every heartbeat of a man sentenced to die. One doctor, years later, reviewed the autopsy. She looked at Nikki's lungs, said they were filled with fluid, signs of infection, not trauma. She saw something else, a tiny skin mark near Nikki's nose. A signal, she said, of a child gasping, struggling to breathe, seizing, alone. Robert had said she had trouble breathing, that she had a seizure before falling asleep. No one had believed him. Not then. Now, someone finally did. A federal court was asked to review the evidence. New experts testified, doubted the old findings. But time had passed. Too much time. The law was rigid, unyielding, and the question returned. Was Robert Roberson a grieving father misjudged by science, or a murderer masked by innocence? Then came Nikki's mother, quiet for years, afraid, shamed, erased. She took the stand, her hands trembling. She said Robert had never hurt Nikki, that he had loved her, protected her, that their daughter had been sick, and they were too poor to understand how sick. She wept and said what no one in the courtroom could bear to hear. I think the system failed us both. And yet the judge did not rule. The appeals dragged on. Meanwhile, Robert aged behind bars. His hair turned white, his body thinned. He began to sleep with one hand on his chest, the way Nikki used to lie on him. And still, every morning, he whispered her name, one breath, soft, angel girl, awaiting the next hearing, the final appeal, or the date of death. And outside, in the world, he would never walk again. A baby's grave sat under a lone pecan tree, covered in small toys, notes, and one cracked porcelain angel, face to the sky, as if waiting for someone to come home. The courtroom grew silent, not with respect, but confusion. Jurors stared as the defense pulled back the veil. It was not just bruises. It was not just bleeding. It was not just the word shaken, repeated like gospel by a parade of state witnesses. It was oxygen deprivation. It was unrecognized pneumonia. It was untreated seizures. The baby had been to the emergency room just days earlier, discharged with antibiotics. Despite struggling to breathe, despite twitching limbs, despite a weak cry, that same cry, the father would later hear in his nightmares, thinned and strangled by fluid in her lungs. Not his hands. A nurse had noticed the signs of distress, but the note never made it to the admitting doctor, and no one told Robert. When Robert testified, he did not shout, he did not cry. He looked numb, like a man who had been surviving inside a nightmare, not living. I tried to wake her up, he said. She was not breathing. I panicked. I screamed. I shook her just a little. I wanted her to wake up. Those words, just a little, were twisted, not by the jury, but by the system that wanted to tie a bow on a horror and call it justice. The prosecutor's voice echoed. She admitted it himself. He shook the baby. A mother in the back row clenched her fists because she had shaken her son once when he choked on a grape. Another juror looked down at the photo of Nikki, so peaceful, eyes closed, lips parted, as if she were sleeping. But this was not sleep. This was forever. The pathologist had testified. Shaken baby syndrome, subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhaging, classic triad, except that same triad had been found in children who died of meningitis, of accidental falls, of oxygen deprivation from seizures, and no bruises, no neck damage, no external injuries. That fit the profile of violent shaking. Still, the verdict came down like thunder, guilty of capital murder. The courtroom gasped. Robert collapsed, hands over his face. as if trying to shield himself from a world that had already decided. One reporter wrote, "He showed no emotion." Another said, "Cold, calculated." But the guard who walked him back to the cell, he said something else. He was whispering her name over and over, like a prayer or a confession. Years passed. Robert Roberson sat in a cell, walls stained with time, floor marked with the quiet scuffs of other men's hopelessness. Outside, science moved forward. Experts began questioning shaken baby syndrome. The medical community grew divided. Innocence organizations took notice. They read the transcripts, the medical records. They ignored history of Nikki's seizures, the missing blood gas data, the ER nurse's note, never introduced at trial. They filed appeals. And in 2016, a Texas court agreed to hear it again. But justice is not a door you knock on once. It is a maze, walled by egos, politics, and the fear of admitting wrong. One appellate judge privately expressed doubt, but wrote, "It is not the court's job to determine innocence, only procedural fairness." So Robert remained behind bars, not because of what he did, but because of what was omitted, because of what the state needed him to be: a monster, simple, savage, silent, not a grieving father, not a poor man, not an addict in recovery, not a man failed by doctors, by nurses, by fate. Outside in Palestine, Texas, the trailer home where it all happened was now abandoned, paint peeling, a child's broken tricycle rusting beside the stairs. Inside, the crib was gone, the pink blanket gone, but the stain on the carpet, still faintly visible. The neighbor said she still saw Robert in her dreams, not hurting Nikki, but holding her, rocking her, whispering lullabies. "I do not think he did it," she said, "but I think he believes he did." And that is worse. In 2020, new evidence came, more experts, more doubt. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Robert Roberson deserved a new hearing, but not a new trial. So he waits for someone, anyone, to say, "We were wrong." A cardboard box sits in his cell. Inside, a photograph of Nikki, her last Halloween, dressed as a butterfly, wings too big for her tiny body. Next to it, a worn Bible, pages smudged, folded over Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." Robert underlines it. Every time the parole is denied, he is not eligible because of the word, capital, because Texas does not like to admit error, even when the baby's lungs were full of fluid, not justice, even when the father's tears were seen as manipulation, not mourning, even when the truth was buried beneath layers of confirmation bias, junk science, and desperation for closure. The warden walks the hall some nights, pauses outside Robert's door, listens to the whisper, "Nikki, Nikki, Nikki," and somewhere, in a courtroom far from the cell, a district attorney turns out the light, puts on a podcast about a different wrongful conviction, and sleeps like nothing ever bled. A courtroom in Texas, pale, windowless, suffocating in silence. Years after Night Emily died, the trial of Robert Roberson was replayed again, this time not in the media, but in the appellate courts. The questions were no longer who or how, but why. Why did so many experts rely on science that has since been widely discredited? Why did the justice system move with such certainty, while the evidence whispered confusion? Why did no one listen when Robert said, "I never hurt her," with the trembling voice of a man who had already lost everything? The doctors who had testified at trial had spoken of shaken baby syndrome, with the kind of authority that made juries sit straighter in their seats. They told of internal brain bleeding, of retinal hemorrhages, of trauma so severe it could only come from violence. But years later, those same symptoms were called ambiguous. Modern medicine had learned more. Seizure, infections, and even minor falls could cause similar injuries. Emily's respiratory issues her high fevers, her previous hospital visits. All dismissed, all forgotten. Robert's defense had been thin. One overworked public defender, a handful of hours to prepare, and a jury that wanted certainty in a world full of doubt. They saw a quiet, withdrawn father. They mistook grief for guilt. They mistook trauma for cruelty, and the silence of a man broken by loss for the calculated calm of a killer. In prison, Robert aged beyond his years. His cell was a coffin of regret and confusion. He read Bible verses every night. He replayed every moment of that day. Her cough, her nap, her stillness. He had done CPR. He had screamed for help. And in return, he was called a monster. Outside the prison walls, a small group of advocates refused to let the case disappear. Lawyers, journalists, scientists, they combed through autopsy reports. They found inconsistencies. They found doubt. They discovered that the original pathologist had revised his conclusions years later, admitting that he could no longer say with certainty that Emily's death was caused by abuse. But the courts were unmoved. Once the machine of justice starts turning, it rarely reverses. In 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Robert Roberson's final appeal, not because he was proven guilty beyond question, but because the system believed the trial had been fair enough. A man could be executed, they ruled, even if his conviction was based on now discredited science, so long as the process itself had followed protocol. Truth, it seemed, was not the point. Procedure was. Emily's grave sits on a hill in Palestine, Texas. It is modest. A small stone angel watches over her. Plastic flowers faded by sun, and time lies scattered around her name. No one visits anymore. No candles. No balloons. No justice. Robert remains on death row. He rarely speaks to anyone. His voice has gone hoarse. His hands tremble with age. Each year, he watches new inmates arrive, many younger, many louder. He is the ghost in the corner, the man they whisper about, the baby killer who never confessed, the father who insists he only tried to save her. Is he a monster, or a man destroyed by grief, punished for not being perfect in his pain? Is this justice, or an old machine grinding too loud to hear the truth? The system does not like gray. It prefers black and white. But in that hospital room, in that courtroom, in that cell, everything was gray, clouded, confused, tragic. Emily would be 20 today, a young woman, maybe in college, maybe still struggling with asthma, maybe still holding her father's hand on long car rides. But the timeline split one morning in 2002, and neither of them came back. This story does not end with answers. It ends with silence, with a father behind bars, with a child buried too soon, and with a justice system that decided it was easier to bury doubt than to face it, easier to close a case than to open old wounds, easier to kill a man than to admit, we might have gotten it wrong.